What if a queen's entire existence, her legacy, and her personal identity were built upon a secret so dark it shattered the very foundation of her rule? What if the bloodline that was meant to define her destiny was forever stained by the consequences of an unimaginable act of inbreeding? This is not a work of fiction, but the harrowing reality of one of history's most tragic monarchs, a woman whose story reveals the terrifying price of political power, familial loyalty, and the obsessive, self-destructive pursuit of royal purity. The story of Queen Isabella II of Spain is a chilling saga of a life lived in a gilded cage, where personal happiness was sacrificed at the altar of the state and the whispers of scandal echoed louder than any royal decree. She was a queen who inherited not just a throne, but the deep, unsettling echoes of a bloodline tainted by the pursuit of purity, a pursuit that had twisted its own genetics into a tragic vulnerability. This is the shocking tale of a queen who, caught in a web of political manipulation and personal despair, gave birth to her own father's child, a story that exposes the twisted world of royal inbreeding and its devastating effects on the lives of those caught within its tangled web. Her life, a heartbreaking odyssey from a celebrated infant queen to a reviled exile, serves as a stark reminder that a crown, no matter how heavy with gold and jewels, can never outweigh the burden of a cursed inheritance. To understand the tragedy of Isabella II, one must first look back into the suffocating, incense-filled chambers of the Spanish Bourbon Dynasty, a royal house that had, for generations, practiced a perilous alchemy. They believed that by turning inward, by marrying cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, they could distill their royal blood into its purest, most potent form. They sought to create a lineage so blue, so undiluted, that its right to rule would be as unquestionable as the divine. But in this obsessive quest for purity, they had unknowingly sown the seeds of their own decay, creating a genetic legacy as fragile as it was supposedly sacred. The Spain into which Isabella was to be born was a nation teetering on the precipice of chaos. The early 19th century was a maelstrom of political turmoil. The embers of the Napoleonic Wars still glowed, and the country was violently torn between the old world of absolute monarchy and the radical new ideas of liberalism that were sweeping across Europe. At the heart of this storm sat King Ferdinand VII, a monarch whose rule was defined not by wisdom or strength, but by a reactionary and cruel despotism. Ferdinand had already buried 3 wives without producing a male heir to secure the throne. The succession was a ticking bomb. According to the Salic law, which had been imported from France, the crown could not pass to a female. This meant that upon Ferdinand's death, his younger brother, the arch-conservative and deeply pious Infante Carlos, was destined to become king. The prospect of King Carlos V filled Spain's burgeoning liberal factions with dread. They saw him as a figurehead for a return to the darkest days of absolutism and religious fanaticism. Desperate for a direct heir and under immense pressure from the liberals who saw a female ruler as their only hope, the aging and ailing Ferdinand took a 4th wife in 1829. His choice was his own niece, Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies. She was vibrant and politically astute, 22 years his junior, and, most importantly, she was his own sister's daughter. Their union was not one of passion, but of dynastic desperation. Another turn of the screw in the long, tragic history of Bourbon inbreeding. In 1830, the royal court held its breath. Queen Maria Cristina was pregnant. Ferdinand, in a moment of audacious political maneuvering, issued the Pragmatic Sanction of 1830, a royal decree that brushed aside the Salic law and re-established Spain's ancient tradition of female succession. The supporters of Infante Carlos were outraged, viewing it as an illegal and treacherous act. The entire future of the Spanish monarchy now rested on the gender of the unborn child. On October 10, 1830, the child was born. It was a girl. She was named Isabella. From the moment she drew her first breath, She was not a daughter, but a political statement. Not an infant, but a symbol. She was the liberals' hope and the absolutists' enemy. Her cradle was not just a bed of silk and lace, but the very epicenter of a looming civil war. The curse of her bloodline was twofold: the genetic frailties passed down through generations of inbreeding, and the political hatred her very existence had ignited. She was crowned in her cradle, but the crown was already wreathed in thorns. Isabella was only 3 years old when her father, Ferdinand VII, finally succumbed to his many ailments in 1833. The moment the old king's death was announced, Spain exploded. Infante Carlos immediately declared himself King Carlos V, and his ultra-conservative supporters, known as the Carlists, rose in rebellion. Thus began the First Carlist War, a brutal 7-year conflict that would drench the Spanish countryside in blood, all in the name of the toddler queen. Isabella's childhood was a phantom of a life, lived within the cold, stone walls of the royal palace of Madrid. She was a queen who could not yet read her own title. Her mother, Maria Cristina, a shrewd and determined woman, became the queen regent, the de facto ruler of Spain. While armies clashed and cities burned in her daughter's name, Maria Cristina navigated the treacherous waters of the court, balancing the demands of the liberal generals who propped up her daughter's throne against the constant threat of Carlist spies and assassins. For young Isabella, life was a series of confusing and stilted rituals. She was dressed in miniature ermine robes, taught to wave from balconies to crowds she couldn't understand, and made to sit through solemn audiences with grim-faced ministers who spoke of battles and betrayals. There was no room for the simple joys of childhood. Her playmates were carefully selected ladies-in-waiting, and her lessons were relentlessly focused on the duties of a monarch. She was surrounded by opulence but starved of genuine affection. She was the most important person in Spain, yet she was utterly powerless, her life and body the property of the state. The environment was one of constant fear and instability. The war was a brutal, grinding affair, and its outcome was far from certain. The Queen Regent, Maria Cristina, ruled with a mixture of political savvy and personal scandal. Her secret morganatic marriage to a former palace guard, Agustin Fernando Muñoz, became an open secret, undermining her authority and providing ammunition for her enemies. For Isabella, this meant growing up in an atmosphere thick with hypocrisy and intrigue. She saw her mother, the regent who demanded absolute loyalty in the name of the crown, engage in a clandestine personal life. She learned from a young age that there was a stark difference between public duty and private desire, and that the former always had to crush the latter. This early education in the dual nature of royalty would have a profound and devastating impact on her own reign. She was being molded into a symbol, but the human being within was being neglected, left to grow wild and untutored in the lonely, gilded cage of her queendom. By the time the First Carlist War finally ended in 1840, Isabella was 10 years old. The Carlists were defeated, for now, and her throne was secure. But the young queen was already a veteran of a war she had never seen, and a captive of a crown she had never asked for. As Isabella blossomed into a teenager, the question of her marriage became the paramount obsession of every court in Europe. The husband of the Queen of Spain would not merely be a consort. He would be a king-in-waiting, a figure of immense political influence. The choice of suitor was a delicate and dangerous chess game, with the major powers, Britain, France, and Austria, all vying to place their preferred candidate on the marital throne beside Isabella. Isabella herself, now a young woman with a robust constitution and a famously passionate and impulsive nature, had her own desires. She was drawn to handsome, dashing figures, and was said to be infatuated with her dashing cousin, the Infante Enrique, Duke of Seville. But her personal preferences were deemed irrelevant. a frivolous distraction from the grave matters of state. The French king, Louis Philippe, was particularly determined to reassert Bourbon influence. He, along with conservative factions within the Spanish court, pushed for a candidate who would be pliable and pose no threat to the established order. Their choice fell upon a man who was, in every conceivable way, the antithesis of the vibrant young queen. Her double first cousin, Francisco de Assis, Duke of Cádiz. The arrangement was a masterpiece of political cynicism. Francisco was widely known within court circles to be effeminate and rumored to be homosexual. He was slight of build, high of voice, and possessed a quiet, retiring nature. The political logic was cruel but clear. Such a man would be unlikely to dominate his wife or sire a new, ambitious line of heirs that could destabilize the delicate balance of power. He was, in essence, a safe, ceremonial husband, chosen precisely for his perceived inadequacies. When Isabella was informed of the decision, she was horrified. "No, with Paquita, no," she is famously said to have cried, using an insulting feminine nickname for Francisco. She protested. She wept. She raged against her mother and her ministers, but the machinery of state was relentless. Her duty, she was told, was not to her heart, but to her crown and to the stability of Spain. On October 10, 1846, on her 16th birthday, Isabella was led to the altar in a double wedding ceremony designed to appease the European powers. As she married Francisco de Assis, her younger sister, Luisa Fernanda, was married to the Duke of Montpensier, the son of the French king. The wedding was a magnificent spectacle of royal pomp, but for Isabella, it was the formal beginning of a lifetime of personal misery. The wedding night was, by all accounts, a disaster. It is said that Isabella, upon seeing her husband's lavishly embroidered nightclothes, cynically remarked, "I thought I was marrying a man, but this is a woman." The marriage was a sham from its very inception. Francisco spent much of his time engaged in courtly pastimes, while the passionate and lonely queen, trapped in a loveless and unconsummated union, began to look elsewhere for the affection and companionship she so desperately craved. The state had secured its political alliance, but in doing so, it had created a personal vacuum at the heart of the monarchy. A void that would soon be filled with scandal, whispers, and the very illegitimacy the court had so desperately sought to avoid. The royal marriage, a hollow political contract, quickly disintegrated into a cold and distant arrangement. Francisco and Isabella lived largely separate lives within the sprawling palace, their union a subject of court gossip and public ridicule. For the young queen, starved of love and trapped in a role that demanded everything from her but offered no personal solace, the gilded cage of the monarchy became an unbearable prison. It was in this atmosphere of profound loneliness and emotional neglect that she began to seek comfort in the arms of other men. Isabella's reign was marked by a succession of lovers, a fact that was an open secret in Madrid and a source of constant scandal across Europe. From dashing military officers to charismatic politicians and even talented opera singers, the Queen's affairs were numerous and often indiscreet. This was not merely the behavior of a wanton monarch. It was the desperate act of a woman seeking the human connection that her politically engineered marriage had denied her. The true crisis, however, began with the Queen's pregnancies. The curse of the Bourbon bloodline, weakened by generations of inbreeding, manifested itself in the most tragic way possible. Isabella suffered through a series of miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths. She bore 12 children in total, but only 5 would survive into adulthood. Each pregnancy was a national event, fraught with political tension, and each loss was a public tragedy and a personal agony for the Queen, deepening the sense of a cursed and failing dynasty. With each new pregnancy, the whispers in the palace grew to a roar. Given the nature of her marriage to Francisco, The question of the paternity of her children became the most explosive secret in Spain. Was the effeminate Paquita, who showed little interest in his wife, truly the father of the royal heirs? Or were they the product of the queen's well-known liaisons? The survival of her first son, Alfonso, born in 1857, was a moment of national celebration, but it was also the beginning of the most enduring and damaging rumor of her reign. It was widely believed, both within the court and among the public, that Alfonso's biological father was not Francisco de Assis, but a handsome captain of the guard named Enrique Puigmolto y Mayans. The physical resemblance between the young prince and the captain was noted by many, and the rumor took on a life of its own, casting a permanent shadow of illegitimacy over the heir to the throne. This question of paternity was not mere courtly gossip. It had profound political implications. For the Carlists and other enemies of the Queen, it was the ultimate weapon. They could now argue that not only was Isabella's own claim to the throne legally dubious due to the pragmatic sanction, but that her heir was a bastard with no legitimate right to rule. The very bloodline she was supposed to perpetuate was now seen as hopelessly contaminated, not by foreign influence, but by the Queen's own alleged indiscretions. In a horrifying twist of fate, the most shocking rumor of all began to circulate, one that tied the Queen's personal tragedy directly back to the dynastic sins of her father. Given the well-known history of incest within the European royal houses, whispers began to surface that the true father of one of her children was not a lover, but her own father, King Ferdinand VII. This claim, while lacking any concrete evidence and likely a product of the most vicious political slander, was born from the grotesque reality of royal inbreeding. The practice of uncle-niece and cousin-cousin marriages had so blurred the lines of kinship that such a horrific accusation, in the minds of a cynical public, seemed disturbingly plausible. It was the ultimate manifestation of the curse, a dynasty so turned in on itself that it was now accused of consuming its own in the most taboo way imaginable. Isabella was trapped. The state had forced her into a barren marriage, and her human need for affection had led her down a path that now threatened to destroy her reign and the legitimacy of her own children. The womb that was supposed to secure the future of the Bourbon dynasty was now seen as the source of its greatest shame, and the Queen, once a symbol of hope, was increasingly viewed as the tainted heart of a corrupt and decaying monarchy. The final years of Isabella's reign saw the slow, inexorable crumbling of her authority. The whispers of the palace had escaped the court and become the angry shouts of the street. Her personal life, once a subject of secret gossip, was now openly derided in satirical pamphlets and newspapers. She was portrayed as a frivolous, incompetent, and immoral ruler, a symbol of everything that was wrong with a monarchy detached from the realities of its people. The political situation in Spain was a powder keg. The country was plagued by economic instability, military coups, pronunciamientos, and a deepening divide between the conservative forces that supported the throne and the increasingly powerful coalition of liberals, progressives, and Republicans who demanded radical change. Isabella, who lacked the political acumen and personal discipline of her mother, proved utterly incapable of navigating these treacherous currents. She ruled erratically, lurching from one political crisis to another, alienating her allies and emboldening her enemies. Her government became notorious for its corruption and favoritism, with political appointments and military promotions often decided by the Queen's latest whim or the influence of her current favorite. This cronyism eroded the last vestiges of respect for the crown and fueled the conviction among many that the entire monarchical system was rotten to the core. The storm finally broke in September 1868. While the Queen was vacationing in the north of Spain, a cabal of high-ranking liberal generals, led by figures like Juan Prim and Francisco Serrano, launched a military uprising. What began as a pronunciamiento quickly escalated into a full-blown revolution, which would become known as the Glorious Revolution. the rebellion spread like wildfire. The queen's forces, demoralized and poorly led, offered little resistance. The Spanish people, weary of years of instability, corruption, and scandal, largely welcomed the revolutionaries. There was no great outpouring of loyalty for the beleaguered queen. Her reign had been stripped of all moral and political authority. Isabella, cut off from her power base in Madrid, was forced to confront the shattering reality that her reign was over. The crown she had worn since she was a child had been torn from her head not by a foreign invader, but by her own people. With her royal train, she crossed the border into France, beginning a long and bitter exile from which she would never return as a ruler. In a final, desperate act to preserve her family's claim, she formally abdicated in 1870 in favor of her son, Alfonso. It was a poignant and deeply ironic moment. She was relinquishing her crown to the very son whose questionable paternity had so fatally undermined her rule. The throne was passed on, but it was a tarnished and weakened institution, its divine right shattered and its future dependent on the whims of military generals and political factions. The queen who was born a symbol of a new era for Spain left her country as a symbol of its abject failure, a monarch undone by the very blood she was born to represent. Isabella's life in exile was a long, slow descent into obscurity. Settling in Paris, she was now the Queen in Exile, a title that carried the weight of past grandeur but none of its power. The grand palaces of Madrid were replaced by a comfortable but far less stately residence in the French capital. The throngs of courtiers and ministers were gone, replaced by a dwindling circle of loyalists and family members. Freed from the constraints of the Spanish court, Isabella's personal life continued to be tumultuous. However, her actions no longer had the power to shake a kingdom. She was a private citizen, albeit a very wealthy and well-connected one, and her affairs became a matter for the gossip columns of Paris rather than the political discourse of Spain. From her exile, she watched the chaotic political experiment that her abdication had unleashed. Spain lurched from a short-lived republic to a brief and unsuccessful reign by an Italian prince, Amadeo of Savoy. The country remained deeply unstable, proving that the removal of the monarch had not magically solved its deep-seated political and social problems. Throughout this period, Isabella never fully relinquished her political ambitions. She continued a constant stream of correspondence with her supporters in Spain, plotting and scheming for a Bourbon restoration. Her primary focus was her son, Alfonso. She poured her energy into ensuring that he received the education and political grooming necessary to one day reclaim the throne she had lost. It was a complex and often strained relationship. Alfonso represented both her greatest hope for the future of her dynasty and the living embodiment of the scandals that had led to her downfall. In 1874, the opportunity finally came. Another military pronunciamiento in Spain swept away the fledgling republic and, in the ensuing power vacuum, the politicians turned once again to the Bourbons as a symbol of stability. Isabella's son was proclaimed King Alfonso XII of Spain. It was a moment of bittersweet victory for the exiled queen. Her dynasty had been restored, but she was not welcome to return and share in its triumph. The new government in Spain, wary of her scandalous reputation and erratic political instincts, made it clear that while her son was king, she was to remain in Paris. She was the ghost at the feast of the Bourbon Restoration, the necessary but embarrassing matriarch whose presence would only stir up the ghosts of the past. Isabella lived out the rest of her days in Paris, a figure of faded glamour and profound tragedy. She outlived her son, Alfonso XII, who died young from tuberculosis, and saw her grandson, Alfonso XIII, ascend to the throne. She died in 1904, having spent the last 3 decades of her life as a queen without a kingdom, a mother whose son had reclaimed her crown but could never fully erase the stain of her legacy. The story of Queen Isabella II of Spain is more than just the biography of a single monarch. It is a chilling cautionary tale about the inherent dangers of dynastic power. Her life was a tragic confluence of personal flaws and systemic failures, a life shaped and ultimately destroyed by a legacy of inbreeding and the cynical pursuit of political power. The obsession with pure royal blood, a cornerstone of European monarchies for centuries, proved to be a fatal paradox. In the case of the Spanish Bourbons, this quest for purity led to a bloodline so genetically compromised that it produced a dynasty plagued by physical ailments, high infant mortality, and psychological instability. Isabella was the ultimate victim of this legacy, a woman whose body and mind bore the scars of her ancestors' choices. Her reign was a microcosm of the clash between the ancient world of divine right and the modern world of popular sovereignty. She was a monarch ill-equipped to handle the rising tide of liberalism and republicanism, and her personal scandals provided the perfect justification for those who sought to dismantle the old order. The rumors about her fathering her own child, while likely a vile slander, were believable only because the system of royal intermarriage had made such taboos thinkable. Yet, in the final analysis, Isabella's story is one of profound human tragedy. She was a woman placed in an impossible position from birth, denied the chance for a normal life or a happy marriage, and used as a pawn in the great game of European politics. Her flaws were many, but they were flaws forged in the crucible of a lonely childhood and a loveless existence. She sought in the arms of lovers the warmth and affection that her crown could never provide, and for that human failing, she lost everything. The legacy she left behind is complex and deeply unsettling. While she was reviled and exiled, it was her son, Alfonso XII, the very child whose legitimacy was so questioned, who ultimately restored the Bourbon monarchy, ushering in a period of relative stability. The curse of her bloodline, in a final, ironic twist, had become the catalyst for the dynasty's survival. Today, as we look back at the grand portraits of Queen Isabella II, we see not just the jewels and the ermine, but the sad, haunted eyes of a woman trapped by her own heritage. Her story serves as an enduring and powerful warning that the pursuit of power at any cost, especially when built on the flawed foundation of blood purity, inevitably leads not to strength but to ruin. It is a testament to the fact that no dynasty, no matter how powerful, can escape the consequences of its own sins, and that the human heart will always rebel against a cage, no matter how gilded it may be. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more absolutely insane historical content that your teachers were too polite to mention, hit that subscribe button right now, like, share, and comment below. See you in the next one.